Welcome to the CBIA BizCast powered by Google. On this podcast, we dive into stories about Connecticut businesses.
Downs Construction actually came to my school.
And business leaders.
I think it's always also really important to be able to see a path forward
for shaping the future of Connecticut's economy.
Welcome back to the BizCast. I'm Amanda Marlowe, and this week we are joined by Meghan Scanlon, CEO of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Welcome to the BizCast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much for coming in. And this is a special episode because we're going to talk a little bit about what the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence is, a little bit about your background, and then how employers can kind of get involved and really be aware of what's going on and how they can play a role in this picture. So why don't you first tell us a little bit about what the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence is?
Sure. Yeah. So we are the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We are the state's leading voice for survivors and victims of domestic violence and their families. And so we accomplish our mission to essentially reduce violence throughout the communities, specifically around family violence and intimate partner violence through outreach, education, training, technical assistance, and advocacy. We have 18 member organizations across the state that provide direct domestic violence services, from sheltering to counseling to children's services, and everything in between that survivors and their families may need if and when they find themselves needing to flee a very dangerous situation.
And, this is something that I think has been going on for so long, but it hasn't really always been talked about as much as we're hearing today.
Yeah, so the coalition itself started in 1978. It was like a bunch of women that got together and said, we need to do something about this. And obviously since then, we've really formalized the movement in terms of domestic violence. And we made a lot of progress in terms of talking about it more openly and publicly, and there being reduced stigma and shame around sharing stories, which has been great. But we still have a lot of work to do. Traditionally, this issue, I think, has been seen as very much a criminal justice issue. And that's true. We still get a majority of our referrals through the criminal justice system, but the coalition is really focused on how do we get to people and provide them the education and training and awareness before they end up in the criminal justice system. So we would argue that we really take a stance that this is much more of a public health issue than it is a criminal justice issue.
And I want to dive a little bit more into that in a few minutes, but let's talk about how you got involved with this organization. Yeah. You've been here for a couple of years now.
Yeah, it'll be 3 years in June. Wasn't looking to be here, actually, but I was working, I actually worked in federal and state government for a while, doing advocacy in the U.S. House of Representatives and U.S. Senate. My passion became women and children's issues, mostly because those were the issues that, quite frankly, at the end of the day, seem to be cut from the federal budget when it gets down to all those tough decisions. So that's where it started, and then I carried that through to nonprofit work with Connecticut Voices for Children, and then ran a regional center on the shoreline, Women and Family Life Center, that helped women and children in crisis, not just necessarily domestic violence. We did, people had mental health, homelessness, other issues that they were trying to transition out of to a better place. But what I did find through that work is that a good amount of the individuals that we were serving had some sort of family or intimate partner violence trauma in their past, either in their very immediate past or over the course of their lifetime. So it kind of led me to want to do something bigger. And when this opportunity came up, I just actually kind of dismissed it because it was COVID. But then finally applied, and here I am now.
Yeah, it was like a little bit of okay, it's COVID, and here I am. I'm going to totally change my job.
Yeah, and it was like not great timing, right? For a variety of reasons. We had women that we were trying to serve, that we had started an emergency assistance fund through a lot of private partners on the shoreline, where we were just trying to help people survive and get by, because a lot of the individuals lost their jobs. They were in the service industries. So there was that going on. And then there was this sort of like, I have a 6-month-old that the world just shut down, and is this the right thing to do? But I think at the end of the day, the ability to impact and make bigger change across the state is what led me to try. And so here I am.
Were you surprised initially about how, many of the families you said that you were working with always had this tie-in? Was that something that surprised you?
I think it was surprising how much the trauma impacted them and informed some of maybe their life decisions along the way that either led them to homelessness or led them to struggling with mental health issues and managing those issues. I think trauma lives in you, forever. And it's just about getting to the right resources and being able to really manage that trauma. I mean, it doesn't go away. We all have it. But it's compounded, I think, when you're dealing with family and intimate partner, because there's this layer of, I trust and love this person. Why is this happening? I just want the abuse to stop. And it's hard to work through that, especially on your own. I don't know anybody that can successfully do that on their own without some kind of intervention, whether it be therapy or counseling or other clinical services that they may need.
And you mentioned that it was kind of an area that you noticed in the legislature that was always just getting tossed under. What made you so passionate about it? Just, learning the stories?
Yeah, I'm a woman, so I was passionate about it from that angle of, one of my main goals in life is to help uplift other women and children. I feel like children are often forgotten because their voices aren't necessarily at the Capitol, so you have to speak for them. I think even more so now as a mom, I feel much more strongly about, making sure that children's voices or their viewpoint is at the forefront of what we're doing legislatively or how we're appropriating funding, either at the state or federal level.
And you started to get into a little bit before, but, a lot of people think of this as a criminal justice issue, right? Mm-hmm. You look at the police reports overnight, there's so many arrests because of, domestic violence. You call the police, but then you come back. And you think of it as, these people that are always involved in the system. But really it's impacting many more people, who you're walking by in the streets, maybe living and working around, and you don't even realize that.
Yeah, I think one of the privileges I've had in this job is when I meet with people, whether they be legislators or community partners, everybody has told me a story about either themselves or somebody that they know that has been through this. So, we certainly don't see everybody in the state that's impacted by family and intimate partner violence. We know that, right? We serve about 40,000 people a year. We know we're missing people. This issue is personal to me. I've experienced what I wouldn't necessarily have named in my early teens and 20s as dating violence, but certainly now that I have the education and knowledge, I can say, I've experienced this. Some of my best friends have gone through this, and they're seemingly educated, doing very well for themselves, but this is an issue that doesn't know a socioeconomic background. It doesn't necessarily stay within certain geographic demographics. It really, truly does impact over the lifetime 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men. Chances are you're either working next to or walking by or have a friend that has been through this in their lifetime, and they just maybe haven't told you about it.
Your mission is to help more and more people. Yeah. What are some of the new things, specifically, how employers can get involved in how you're trying to continue that mission in the near future?
So statistically, one of the places that survivors feel the safest is in their workplace. So oftentimes it's one of the only places that they go to during a day where they're getting away from the abuse, they're getting away from the stalking, and so it's where they can feel safe. Sometimes it spills over into the workplace, and you can see that in performance issues. You can see that in, we've had instances where the perpetrator just like consistently calls all day the workplace or shows up to make sure that that person is where they say they are going to be. So there's a variety of safety issues, as well as, traumatic issues that individual is going through. And so what we really want to do, we had applied for a U.S. Department of Labor grant under the Women's Bureau that would allow us to start working with employers to really shift the culture around this and shift the narrative and really just provide basic education and awareness that, hey, this is what happens in the workplace. Like, this is domestic violence 101, so to speak, for employers and employees.
Just so that it's not unseen.
Right, just so that it's not unseen. And so if I disclose to you as my coworker, which we know happens too, because you have your, closest coworkers that become friends either, oftentimes outside of the workplace, but certainly inside the workplace, that you may say, this is happening. It also, the idea is to empower those individuals with some information about resources so that if and when somebody discloses to you, okay, here, call Safe Connect. It's the statewide domestic violence hotline. You can get information because unfortunately we've had, at least in the last 2 years, we've had individuals murdered who have disclosed to their coworkers what's going on. And frankly, the feedback that we got was, I didn't really know what to do. I didn't know where to turn them to. All I knew was to say, hey, maybe you should call the police. And we know that that's not always the safest thing to do in certain situations. So if you can connect them to the resources that we have across the state, chances are we can work with them on a safety plan. We can make sure that they're being thoughtful around that strategy, and we can explore all those options. And if and when law enforcement is supposed to be called, absolutely, we'll be able to guide them through that. But it's very much a culture shift for employees and employers to recognize that this is something that happens in the workplace, and we should know what to do if and when it does happen.
And what are some best practices, or how if an employer says, hey, yes, we want to get involved, we want to offer resources, what should they be doing?
I mean, look, you can start small. So we always say, even if you just want to have the resources in a shared space where everybody goes to, whether it's the break room or bathrooms or whatever, we'll start as small as having posters and magnets just with the hotline and the resources across the state. From there, I think we encourage employers and employees to, we do training, we do it for free, to have us come in and train or do it virtually, whatever works best for that subset of employees and employers. And then I think, ultimately, sort of the best practice level would be to have somebody in the organization, maybe self-identified 1 or 2 people, that raise their hand and say, hey, you know what, I want to be the go-to person on this. We actually have a special training for those individuals. It's not necessarily a full-on domestic violence certification that our advocates go through, but it's fairly close. And then that person is is sort of that trusted go-to person within the organization, so that if something is disclosed, they get connected to that individual. That individual has a little bit more in-depth knowledge of the services and the process and how DV presents, and can work with that individual to get them connected to services in a much more impactful way. So that's all. Those are sort of those tiers. So it's whatever works for different employers and employees.
But there's so many different avenues just to at least, maybe if you're touching 1 to 2 people, it's really going a long way.
Yeah, and I think the goal of this too is to really emphasize, to meet people where they are in the community, but emphasize that bystanders, the people that are receiving this information, have a lot of power in that situation. When somebody gets to a place where they disclose something that vulnerable to you, you have this moment to build trust with them and connect them to something, or you have this moment to do nothing. And I mean, obviously, I would argue doing nothing is not an option.
You also mentioned, it's common for people to show up at the workplace. What if what if employees are seeing that? The person hasn't disclosed much, but they're starting to see a trend.
Yeah, I think then, if depending on the relationship, you may feel comfortable to go to that person individually, but if you don't, that's where, if you do have that trusted staff member, it might be worth saying, hey, like, I've noticed this pattern, what do you think we should do? And certainly, consult with those trusted staff members, depending on who they are.
Now, why do you think now is such a good time for employers to take action and be involved? I mean, we're talking about, shifting cultures in many workplaces. Why do you think now is a good fit too?
I think actually, honestly, COVID. I mean, I think one of the things that COVID did, for better or worse, was sort of like really blurred the lines between home and work, for good and bad ways. But I think coming out of that, I think everybody has a different level of appreciation or knowledge about like how hard life can be in general, and a willingness to help. And I think as we figure out this sort of hybrid culture, I think now is a great time to try to even infiltrate the culture around gender-based violence in the workplace, and acknowledge that it's something that is happening, and we can do something about it. So I just think that everybody's priorities shifted post-COVID, or whatever you want to call the post-COVID world. And I think people are much more receptive to this kind of work than they would have been before.
What's the feedback you've gotten so far from employers?
Mostly positive. So I would say employers recognize, at least those in decision-making roles, definitely recognize the need for it, have recognized that there's been things that have happened over the course of their careers that they wish they would have just better understood and known about the resources. So I think that's been a really positive. I think the other thing that doing the work every day that you don't necessarily appreciate, and CBIA has been an amazing partner to allow us to go and attend different events, big events that you've all hosted over the last several months. But you also realize the lack of awareness and knowledge from the employee, like from all levels, but the employee level. So we have a lot of work to do, because people were very open to our information and our educational materials, but also really realizing like they didn't know we existed in their communities. And so we have these 18 sites that they can access depending on where they live, and people just didn't know about it.
Yeah, they hear it and they're like, oh, it's just like a statewide organization, but don't realize that, there might be somewhere down the street that's a safe haven.
Yeah, or they know the name, but they didn't really know what they did, right? So like an example of that was like Prudence Crandall is one of our members. They provide, domestic violence services. And so folks were like, oh yeah, like I know that name, but like I didn't know that's what they did.
Yeah, and I know that we've gotten some feedback too from the events, and even people coming up. Oh, you guys mentioned the Connecticut Coalition. Where are they? Like, what are they doing with you? So I think it's really already creating a little bit of a buzz too.
And I think that's the goal. I mean, I think a majority of the issue, if we could work ourselves out of this job, is all about education. 95% of it is education and awareness, and making sure people can easily connect to the resources.
Are there any other specific groups that you're targeting, other places that, seem to be like a safety location or, feeling for people that, you're trying to get the word out to?
Yeah, so we're really trying to get creative about how we get the word out. So workplaces is one. Health professionals has been another big project of ours in terms of getting into specifically OBGYNs, emergency rooms, pediatricians, pretty much anywhere that people will take themselves or their children to. So that's been a big piece of it. We've worked through our child advocacy program around getting into schools more, just to do some of that more prevention work from a very young age, because we obviously know statistically if you have been abused in your past childhood, the chances of you perpetrating or becoming a victim are much higher. So we're trying to get into schools. We also run the fatality review for the state, which is essentially a committee of folks that We'll review the homicides that have happened due to intimate partner violence. And so we're trying something a little different, where we're going to try to engage faith-based leaders and funeral home directors around the issue too. So we're really trying to like meet people where they are in the community, in whatever circumstances they may be.
Is that homicide tracking, is the data from that kind of help guide you in saying, okay, we're hitting someone if the trends are going down?
It helps us in terms of how we can work to prevent, the next, or hopefully prevent all homicides from happening. So yeah, it definitely helps us. We typically every 2 years do a fatality review report, and we release it. So we'll be releasing that this upcoming year. And it helps us to like prioritize some of that systems advocacy work that we would do across the different partners that we work with across the state, whether they be community partners or state agencies. And then it also helps us prioritize what we need to do in terms of the community-based services too.
And you were talking a lot about culture shift, in the workplace, outside of the workplace. I know that when you took on this role, you said that was something that you really wanted to see. Yeah. How have you been able to go about doing that? What have been some of the challenges that you've faced?
Well, coming back from COVID was a big challenge. I think that's still a challenge. I think getting people oftentimes in the same room, right, because of this hybrid work schedule has been a little bit of a challenge. Making sure that we're communicating on all different platforms at this point, whether it be like podcasts, email, social media. I think the other big challenge is there just seems to be so much concentration of information. So not just within this issue, but other issue areas. And so I do think people get to sort of this like information overload space. So we've really been trying to work on like how do we thoughtfully, strategically get our messages out. But we continue to have to work on it just like every other organization.
Have you had any recent success stories with this, or how quickly are you seeing results?
Yeah, so all state agencies had to take the training as of July 1st of this past year. So we actually had an agency that had an incident with an employee, was able to immediately identify that it was intimate partner violence and connect that individual with the HR department, who was able to then connect her to resources, asked all the right questions in terms of, are you safe? What supports do you need? So that's been a great success out of this project so far.
Yeah, just knowing right away where to go.
Yeah.
To help get the situation mitigated as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and for anybody that has any questions, you can always visit our website, which is ctcadv.org, or ctsafeconnect.org is our statewide domestic violence hotline, and that phone number is 888-774-2900. You can call, text, email, chat. It's all free and confidential and 24/7.
Okay, and that's a good, the online website is a good place for employers too who are just interested in learning more about the program.
Absolutely, and even if you want to go on CT Safe Connect, you can just chat with an advocate in real time. If you have a question as an employer, it's also meant for that. So it's not just a hotline for crisis, right? It's for bystanders, it's for family members. If you just want to get more information about how you can get connected or how an individual could get connected, that's something that we do as well.
Okay. And, I know we talk a lot about women, but do you work with men who are also impacted? We work with men that are impacted. We work with LGBTQIA plus individuals. The majority of the people that we serve, just full disclosure, about 97% are women, but we serve all genders and races. Yeah. Are there any goals that you have, for the next few years specifically?
Yeah. My biggest goal is to be able to provide really high quality services across the state. that's a big goal of mine. The other goal is to really meet people where they are in the community, to kind of get outside of traditional avenues that I think we've gotten comfortable in, like, state agencies and all of that, recognizing that not everybody trusts institutions, but they do trust, where they're going in their community, whether it be to their workplace or to school or to an athletic event. So we work with the Yard Goats. All of our posters are in the Yard Goats bathrooms, right? So really, that's what I ultimately want to do. I don't think we'll shift the narrative around domestic violence and reduce some of that hush-hush stigma until we're just everywhere in the community. So that's ultimately my goal.
Yeah, where everyone knows, I hear it, this is where I can go.
Yeah, that's it. If I accomplish that, then I've done my job.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. And, this is the CBIA BizCast, so we often talk with, leaders about some leadership lessons that they've learned. So in your journey, what do you think is some of the biggest lessons that you've learned? You've steered a lot of different types of teams. Yeah. You've, had to cross over between working with state and private officials as well. What do you think is something that you kind of take with you?
Well, the first thing I would say is Connecticut is a small state. So I think building trust and relationships and really keeping to your word is something that's important to me, and I've realized has really benefited me over time. Not saying that all the time everybody's going to be happy with your word, but I think at the end of the day, if you believe that you're doing the right thing and the fair thing, maybe not always making everybody happy, then I think you're doing okay. And the other thing is listening. Coming into this role, there's a lot of different constituencies. You have your board members, you have your staff, you have all of the member agencies, and definitely consistently listening to all those different constituencies, including the survivors, has been something that I've realized is much more important than maybe I would have said 10 years ago. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for those insights and, for all this information for employers. We're hoping, we can start continuing the conversation and getting the word out to employers to get involved.
Great. Thanks for having me. This was great.
Thank you so much, and thank you for listening to this week's BizCast. You can listen, and subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us a review and let us know if you have ideas for a future podcast. And for more episodes, head on over to CBIA.com.